Sometimes the hot desert wind will sweep the searing red sand right over it, or an outback flood will leave it mud-caked and confused like a dried-up creek bed. But the tracks and trails and paths are still there to those who know where to look. They can be dust, gravel, bitumen, or ribbons of concrete leading from here to everywhere. And every day we use the same familiar streets. But there are other streets, not so familiar, but just as important. The streets above us, dividing the 3 million square miles of continent into the measured miles of minutes and hours that make up our air age. The city slips away beneath you. The lean grey skyscrapers yield to the terracotta roofs of the suburbs. And once the farmlands and wheat fields are gone, the signposts of civilization become less and less frequent. Even today it is possible to cross the country seeing only a few lonely homesteads. The rest can be sand and spinifex, brown flintstone ranges and red dust, a shimmering pattern of mirage and heat. But the people who live down below know that this is Australia's air age, and the cities of the coast are coming closer every day. From the air come the people who are changing the loneliness, changing the nation, the engineers, the oilmen, the scientists, the doctors, and the friends. No longer does it have to be the grim landscape that defeated Burke and Wills and made the first arrivals marvel at its sheer immensity. Botany Bay is the birthplace of a nation. A continent surrounded by water, it was once far removed from the trade routes of the world. Captain James Cook, when he acted for the British Crown, gave the first settlers of Australia a life hemmed in by vast distances. Perhaps it was only natural for the people of this new nation to dream the dreams of men who, over the centuries, had sought the secrets of flight. Men like Leonardo da Vinci, who knew there would one day be a flying machine. London's Crystal Palace in 1852. On display were the drawings and a model prepared by a dreamer, Dr. William Bland. Dr. Bland lived in Sydney, Australia, and his atmotic ship, as he called it, was designed to fly non-stop from London to Sydney in just 4 days. Somehow his idea never got off the ground, but others were more practical. A haphazard, wind-borne flight in a balloon was a giant leap into the unknown. Australia's Lawrence Hargrave made contributions to the development of the first heavier-than-air machines. He built a box kite which could lift a load of 208 pounds in a series of experiments at the turn of the century, and discovered that curved wing surfaces give greater lift. From the Wright brothers in 1903, the reality of flying grew swiftly. There were contenders for the honors of making the first flight in Australia. Along came famous Harry Houdini, and as if by magic, his French Voisin aircraft carried the showman on 3 separate flights over the Victorian town of Diggers Rest. The date was March the 18th, 1910. Meanwhile, Victorian farmer John Dwegan also wanted to fly, but no imported machine for him. He built an aircraft from a photograph of a Wright brothers machine, but when this didn't work very well, he made his own. Australia now had its own pilots and its own planes.
I'm Josephine in my flying machine, going up she goes, up she goes, up, up a little bit higher. Oh my, the moon is on fire. Come Josephine in my flying machine, going up, all on, goodbye. a little bit higher. Oh my, the moon is on fire. Come, Josephine, in my flying machine, going up. All on, goodbye.
Thus, the adolescent years slipped by. In 1914, the aeroplane was to come of age. Once it was all over, Australia was quick to take advantage of the changes in aviation the war had brought. In their converted Vickers-Vimy bomber, the Smith brothers took up a challenge. The federal government was offering a £10,000 prize for the first Australians to fly from England in less than 720 hours. Newspapers scoffed that it was all a waste of time. The flight, they said, was impossible. "12,000 miles and 130 hours flying time later, a handshake of welcome proved the critics wrong. Prime Minister Billy Hughes handed over the cheque with a smile. They'd won £10,000 and the acclaim of a nation no longer months away from the world. You couldn't help but be a hero if you could fly like them. Or Hustling Bert Hinkler.
Hustling Hinkler, up in the sky, fair or windy, he's flying high. Fearless, fearless, knows every cloud. The climb of the sun makes a mother feel proud. Hustling Hinkler, rides all alone. In a little plane of his own. Hustling Hinkler shows him the way, and he's a hero of the day. Hustling Hinkler shows him the way, and he's a hero of the day.
The pioneer flyers of the Queensland and Northern Territory aerial services didn't know it in the 20s, but they had begun an international airline. There still remained the Pacific, to challenge one of the greatest airmen who ever lived.
Ozzy is proud of you, proud it's true, of you and your gallant crew, through the storm so terrific, flying all the Pacific. Kingsford Smith, flying by day and night, proved you were true blue. In flying Ozzy will never be at a loss, while we sons like the boys in the Southern Cross. Kingsford Smith, we'll tell the world that we're proud of you.
Suddenly, Smithy was gone. But after him came flyers like Jimmy Mollison, who got from Wyndham to England in 8 days. 1930 saw tiny Amy Johnson prove that flying wasn't all a man's world. Not if a woman could pilot a plane from England. In the short span of 15 years since the flight of Ross and Keith Smith, you could propose holding an air race halfway around the world from England to Melbourne and see Scott and Black win it in their sleek twin-engine de Havilland Comet. They would outpace all the opposition, and over the whole distance, which once seemed impossible to fly, they would take just 71 hours. Not all the records involved long-distance flying. In the fantastically rugged highlands of New Guinea, there'd been the discovery of gold. Roads could not be pushed through the jungle, but you could get over it. So tons of mining machines and whole towns to go with it flown to places like Lae and Wau and Bulolo. Each month, the lumbering aircraft in New Guinea lifted more freight than the rest of the world's air fleet carried in a year. Now there were more and more tasks for aviation, and the pilots flying the skies above Australia. Aeroplanes would grow bigger, faster, more reliable. Over the palm-fringed beaches north of Australia, the same sound. but the chilling knowledge that the scream of an aircraft engine overhead could mean death. If it could be any consolation, there was the knowledge that once this war was all over, Australia would have the basis of an aircraft industry and a new brave breed of pilots to fly the new planes. But before it would end, many of both would be lost. The war in the air ranged far from Australia, but Australian pilots, with their share of a pioneering and adventurous background, made their marks once again with front-line flying in the Battle of Britain, as pathfinders for the Lancasters hitting at Berlin, in strikes at the invisible enemy in the jungle. And when it did end, it was a new era. Airfields would have to change, for this was the era of radar and electronics. The faithful DC-3s would be replaced with a host of post-war planes which blazed new trails in Australian skies. From people everywhere, a new awareness of aviation. It was in 1948 that Convairs became the first pressurized airliners on Australia's domestic routes. Australian airlines were fast winning a world reputation for efficient operations. The first prop jet services outside Europe were made in Australia by Viscounts. To smaller ports went Friendships, while both were followed by the big Electras for intercity flights. The first commercial helicopter reached Australia in 1956. Fast, modern aircraft were shrinking Australia. Tailored for the kind of work they must do, they were converting distance into short spaces of time. Once the toughest overland mail run in the world, the track to Birdsville now comes out of the sky. Birdsville and the outback is linked with Brisbane and the coast. Aircraft bring the supermarket to the cattle station. They span the continent from Perth to Sydney or Melbourne, bring Hobart and the snow country to within hours of the beaches around Cairns. They close the gap between Canberra and Port Moresby. Dust still swirls in the willy-willies that play along the Birdsville's main, in fact its only street. But the people who live there, and in many other places like it, are perhaps most aware how things have changed. A fast-moving shadow on the desert, overcoming distance, the obstacle first beaten by a man who did not fear distance. Captain Cook is remembered today in the name of the machine which inherits the mantle woven by the explorers of the air. This is the latest aircraft in Australian skies, bigger by far than the Seafarer's Endeavour, and costing more too, a cool £2.5 million. This is the Boeing 727. The proud name James Cook goes aloft in a new form, the superb aerodynamic shape of the first jet airliner to fly between the states. The streets in the air are now travelled by some 3 million Australians every year. Every 1.5 minutes, an airliner takes off or lands somewhere along the 65,000 miles of routes flown by our airlines, and the way is smoothed by a massive effort on the ground. Pilots don't teach themselves to fly anymore. They go to school. Once they used to be able to say you flew by the seat of your pants, by instinct, as you sat in the cockpit. Now you sit in a trainer and you fly because you can pass exams every few months. Aircraft are no longer made with paste and paper. They have thousands of intricate pieces, each of them needing the personal touch, even in this era of electronics. People with a variety of highly developed skills work together to provide an airline system that's acknowledged as among the world's best. The men who fly will themselves pay the highest tributes to the experts who handle the skyway traffic. It's no easy job in this air age in which we find ourselves living today, but it too goes off with calm and efficiency. Pilots will acknowledge that the men on the ground keep pace with the machines going into the air. A request for permission to take off. From the tower, instructions on the runway to be used and any changes in the weather or the flight pattern. The clearance for takeoff. Engines roar to life. From the moment it gets the final okay from the air traffic controller and becomes airborne, and until its wheels touch down on a distant tarmac, this airliner will be in contact with civil aviation authorities. It will be locked to radio beams and followed on radar screens. This is the way that aviation has changed half a century. The highways in the sky are getting crowded. Airliners may be flying by day or night through clear skies or avenues of cloud. The airlines are busiest at Christmas time and at special holiday periods. For the organization goes on all the time, around the clock, every day and night of the year. It seems that whenever and wherever there's a family reunion or a big event somewhere, people will fly there. And the pattern of travel, the shadow that skims over the rooftops and the spinifex along its skyways, will have a new and even faster shape. Because this is what is happening in Australian skies. A flight from Melbourne to Sydney for a surf carnival. A flight across a continent to a Perth sports arena where the cheers ring loud. Before this Boeing 727 had its first flight, 6 years of design and 4,500 hours of wind tunnel tests were completed. These preliminaries equal some 15 years of intensive airline use. Passengers assume these things and take them today for granted. They know that they ride in comfort which has cost years of research and millions of pounds to provide. For Australians, it's nice to know that there's a tradition that goes right back to the earliest days of flying, born of a people who found themselves hemmed in by mountains, rivers, and vast distances, and as a result, produced some of the greatest airmen the world has ever known. And now, the jet, a triumph of research, proudly upholds that great Australian aviation tradition, serving the country claimed so long ago by James Cook.